Welcome to Satsunami. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Satsunami. My name's Satsunami, and joining me today aboard the USS Satsunami is none other than the one and only Sean from Review It Yourself. Sean, welcome back.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes, it is a bit rocky on this ship, but we'll make do. This is the movie version, so everything's a wee bit dark, the colours are muted, but we'll persevere, won't we? But yeah, how are you doing tonight?
Yeah, can't complain. It's absolutely boiling hot. So apologies for the listeners if you get any background noise, but I mean, I've turned my fan off, but I'm not doing this with the window shut. I'm sorry. I don't care how much audio quality is important for podcasts, but we're humans, We're not assimilated like the Borg. We need fresh air.
Well, to be fair, they did turn up the heating in this film.
Yes, they need a perfect temperature too, so...
Yeah, I hope that's not going to be the twist by the end of this episode that will be like, resistance is futile. Listen to Satsunami and review it yourself. Your podcast will be assimilated into ours.
Well, it feels like that sometimes, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Desperately trying to assimilate people to listen to your podcast.
Now, I'm not saying that Good Pods is like the Borg cube of podcasts, but they've gone awful quiet since this episode.
Well, I don't know what to make of it. I think I've heard people against them. I've heard people for them. I think it's nice that somebody's trying to do something for indie podcasts, but I'm feeling it's such an uphill battle. Everybody seems to do a podcast now, like absolutely. Even like some of my favourite comedians who I never thought would ever do anything like a podcast have started, and it's like, oh my God. I don't know. It just seems to be becoming such a mainstream thing, but like all the little indie podcasters, we're still not getting like massive traction. I know there's a lot out there, but...
Because, even when I started like streaming in the 2020s, that was the big thing I noticed. People were starting YouTube channels, they were starting Twitch channels, that kind of thing. Like, I noticed that a wee bit, and I noticed that obviously more when I started Satsunami, but as you said, it feels as if now there is a massive spike. I keep getting notifications saying, hey, do you want to improve your podcast? And I'm like, no, I'm talking about Star Trek today, go away.
Just every time you listen to something, you can be listening to like the football, and it's like, and catch up with our brand new podcast, and you're like, what? You're on television? Oh, really? You don't get a podcast? Like, you can have one. Anybody can have one, but I thought it was this nice niche little thing. And oh God, I think I set my phaser to fucking depression at this one, didn't I? Right, back it up a bit. Come on. Right, sorry everybody.
We're just turning the phasers onto ourselves here. This might be like a bloody mainstream podcast. This is our Dominion War. That's what we're saying.
Can we keep them in the neutral zone? They've crossed into Federation space.
And if Paramount or Paramount Plus or any representatives would like to make first contact with ourselves, please let us know, because we could talk about Star Trek for absolute days. So, yeah, feel free.
I mean, I can talk about Star Trek up until 2005 for a long time. After that, gets a little bit sketchy. So, I'm going to go Satsu for that. If you want me to do anything pre-2005, I'm your guy. But after that, not really. I mean, it's okay. I'll give it a go.
But that raises an interesting question, because before we talk about the film we're going to be talking about today, which is arguably the best Star Trek film that they've produced, at least in the TNG era, what is your history with Star Trek? Have you always been a Trekkie, or did it happen in later life?
I wasn't really given much choice. I mean, we've all got baby videos. Well, usually, it's probably as generations go on, and in the back of our baby videos, you had one or two things. You either had the football or Star Trek. There was never an in-between. So I kind of wasn't given much choice. I've said it before on my own podcast that I'm not massively into Star Wars. It's just nothing. It's not something I ever got into. My dad didn't watch it, so it never went on. My dad's massively into films and stuff like that, and TV series. He loves them, but if he didn't like them or didn't fancy them, they didn't go on. So I didn't see quite a lot of stuff like that. And watching things like Star Wars later on, in your late 20s and early 30s, it doesn't quite have. Sorry, everybody. It doesn't quite have the same impact. Whereas when you've grown up with Star Trek, I remember watching the original series as a kid. Obviously not when it was first out, and watching Next Generation when it was first out, and then you got Deep Space Nine, of course, and then into watching Voyager as well. I can't really remember watching Enterprise, but I'm sure my dad watched it, and just loved them. I loved seeing like who the new captains were going to be. We got Janeway, who was fantastic. We got Sisko. So yeah, and I just loved like seeing who the new captains were, although Sisko was a commander. And because I was talking to a Trekkie at work, and I was talking about the captains, and she was like, oh, actually, Sisko was a commander and then a captain. But yeah, so it's something that I always watched, or at least it was always on in the house. I'm not going to pretend as a kid, as a really young kid through the 90s, I was watching it week to week because I wasn't. But it was always around and it was always something that I watched and I really, really enjoyed. And then obviously going back to, with the extra time we had over the past few years to watch things, I went back and watched The Next Generation. I've got the whole DVD box set of that. Love that one. It's one of those things that, if you're away from home or you're flicking through the channels, there's always a Star Trek playing somewhere. So it's always like a go-to for me, and it always has been. I like certainly in the pre-2005 Trek, I like the fact that, yes, like in First Contact, it can get incredibly, incredibly dark. But I like the fact, I've no doubt we'll come on to this later, but I always like the fact that Star Trek said, like, look, we will get past all these petty differences. We'll get past this. The future won't be perfect, but it will be, much more of a kind of a utopia, which, I think, yeah, of course, it's a bit pie in the sky, no pun intended, but I think it's a nicer way to look than, we'll just, than kind of dystopian sci-fi. I think that's what makes Star Trek stand out above a lot of other science fiction. As much as I love a bit of dark science fiction, I think it stands out in that respect that you're always looking ahead with this kind of positive message of we'll get there, rather than what some of the later Star Treks have been doing, which is basically, all the problems we got today, we've still got them. That's my big gripe with the later stuff now. It's just so dystopian that it's not Star Trek, in my opinion. That's an argument for another day.
Yeah, that's next week's episode. Yeah. But funny enough you say that about not really being exposed to Star Wars, because I was actually in the opposite camp. I ended up watching a lot of Star Wars, but when it came to Star Trek for me growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was seen as this very geeky thing, which, it's kind of more mainstream now. It got the Dungeons and Dragons treatment, as it were, where it used to be this really niche thing, and it had its fan base, but people would be like, oh, a Trekkie and everything, oh, pointy ears. But then, of course, when it got more popular, it's more acceptable, quote unquote, I suppose, to like it in the mainstream. But I never really watched Star Trek. I knew of it, but I was definitely more into Star Wars and everything. And then I made friends with someone in school, and the closer we got, he started saying, oh, do you want to watch some Star Trek over at mine? And I was like, yeah, I guess. And they put on TNG and absolutely loved it. I thought it was so fascinating that it wasn't all about fighting and it wasn't all like, constant conflict and things. And obviously there is conflict in pre-Enterprise Star Trek, but at the same time, it wasn't always like that. They had time where they took steps back to come up with a diplomatic solution and really talk out their problems. Didn't always work. Sometimes they had to resort to the phaser every so often, especially in Deep Space Nine, but that's a whole other thing. I was actually saying to you before we started recording tonight that during the 2020 lockdowns, I binged Deep Space Nine, and although that has its dark elements that you would usually associate with more of a darker series, I absolutely fell in love with it because it brought up so many interesting questions without compromising what made Star Trek Star Trek. Don't get me wrong, there are one or two things like the whole Section 31 thing, which, that became completely over the top and everything, but it was a show that was just, as you said, it stood out, it was completely different, and I absolutely loved it. But I have to say, in terms of the films, I never really watched many of them. I watched bits and pieces. I think I actually watched the J.J. Abrams films, like the first two, before I got round to watching the motion picture, the TOS ones, and of course, only recently I've actually caught up and watched, most of the TNG films, which it's been quite an interesting insight comparing it to the series. But see, without any further ado, I feel as if we have kept back our thoughts long enough, so as always, we will be right back after these transmissions. Welcome to Satsunami, a variety podcast that discusses topics from gaming and films to anime and general interests.
Previously on Satsunami, we've analysed what makes a good horror game, conducted a retrospective on Pierce Brosnan's run as James Bond, and listened to us take deep dives into both the Sonic and Halo franchises.
Also, if you're an anime fan, then don't forget to check us out on our sub-series, Satsunami, where we dive into the world of anime. So far, we've reviewed things like Death Note, Princess Mononoke, and the hit Beyblade series.
If that sounds like your cup of tea, then you can check us out on Spotify, iTunes, and all good podcast apps.
As always, stay safe,
Stay awesome, and most importantly,
stay hydrated. This episode is sponsored by Zencastr. If you're a podcaster that records remotely like me, then you'll know how challenging it can be to create the podcast you've always wanted. That's where Zencastr comes in. Before I met Zencastr, I was but a naive podcaster, recording on low quality, one-track audio waves. But with Zencastr, you can kiss those fears goodbye as they provide crystal clear audio and HD video. Plus, with our all-in-one podcasting suite, recording with guests is extremely simple. From local recordings to post-production, Zencastr has it all. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code Satsunami. You'll get 30% off your first 3 months of Zencastr Professional. I want you to have the same easy experience I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story.
Imagine a race of beings possessed of one mind, driven by one will, intent on one purpose: to seize our past and control our future.
Set a course for Earth. Maximum warp.
Now, one captain against orders
Red alert! All hands to battle stations!
must succeed where all others have failed.
It looks like the control deck's 26 up to 11.
They have assimilated more than half the ship.
Surrender yourself or we will destroy your ship.
The line must be drawn here.
On November 22nd, resistance is futile. Star Trek: First Contact.
So let's talk some First Contact, because I think the reason we had the idea for this episode was I had put up a thing on Twitter saying that I was watching it, and then you'd replied saying, if you want someone to talk to about it on an episode, then I'm here. And I was like, yes, get back on this podcast. The Bake Off's not on for another couple of months. Get back on here.
True. I saw it and I was like, oh, me, please. Well, because it's always great chatting with you. But then, I mean, it's Star Trek and it's some of the best stuff they've done. I mean, arguably the best film they've done. I can't pass this up. Like, I don't care how many other people he talks to about the other ones. I need to take First Contact, because I remember I watched the films a little bit later as well. Certainly didn't watch them when they came out. And when you watch them all together, like, First Contact is one of the ones that, yes, with Wrath of Khan, we know. But in terms of the TNG one, like The Next Generation, it is by far the best one. Just in terms of an all-round film and the tone and the characters, although we'll come on to the characters later. But must remember I'm not hosting this one. But yeah, I mean, it's such a standout film, and I was like, I have to talk about this, because that Star Wars, especially later, that it kind of thunders above all, and I sometimes feel like it's like, oh, can we talk about some classic Star Trek? I know there's a lot of love for it out there, and there's quite a few podcasts who do Trekkie stuff, but just thought, I have to talk about this one.
Would you believe, though, that this is the very first episode that we've had talking about Star Trek? I mean, technically there is one on Patreon where I was talking about Picard, but in terms of the mainstream, this is really the first episode I actually get to geek out about Star Trek with someone else on the channel. So absolutely, I am so excited, because when I first heard about this film, I think I must have been about 4 or 5 years old when First Contact came out. It came out in 1996, so I was definitely far too young to be watching it.
I'd have been about 4 or 5, yeah.
Let alone know what Star Trek was at the time. So yeah, unfortunately I wouldn't have been there for the big event or anything, but I bet you there's a couple of older Trekkies just like shaking their head listening to this, being like, oh man, I remember I was there first day. Yeah, I was actually surprised at how well this film held up, because it seems as if they've got quite an infamous reputation, don't they?
Oh, the films, definitely. I mean, there's the whole, I can't remember, the odd ones that are meant to be bad, the evens or whatever. They're not as topsy-turvy as, say, the Halloween franchise, so let's not get too ahead of ourselves, but they are a little bit, the quality does go up and down. It's because some of the films, especially like the original series and the Next Generation ones, they go kind of a little bit out to left field every now and again, and you can either go with that concept or you can't. And if you can go with it and enjoy yourself, great, but if you can't go with it might be a bit of a slog, so it's one of those things. But this had a really good setup as well. I mean, they say in it that 6 years ago Picard was assimilated by the Borg, which was in the Best of Both Worlds Part 1, which is the series 3 finale, episode 26. And then the Best of Both Worlds Part 2 was the opener for season 4, obviously episode 1. So it fit in really nicely, but which actually was out in 1990, so technically it was 6 years ago. This film starts and you get that fantastic sweeping score, which they've just used for Picard, actually, season 3, which is by Jerry Goldsmith. And it's just unbelievable. It's probably one of the best Star Trek themes you've got outside of Voyager, but it's just lovely.
But something I do find really interesting about this film in particular is there's a lot of films out there in Star Trek that they don't really reference that much unless they've made a big impact. Like, for example, with the J.J. Abrams films, you have the infamous Into Darkness where they do the whole Khan storyline.
I still haven't got over that.
Yeah, I know it's different timelines and everything, but the fact that you have this reboot referencing a film from years and years ago and they're using it as a plotline for the new films, that is interesting that they're still using it. And it's the same with First Contact, because one of the things I do find absolutely fascinating though about First Contact is the fact that they really draw a lot of references, homages, whatever you want to call them, towards this film in later series. Like, for example, Enterprise has tons of them. They use the launch of the Phoenix in the intro. They have the whole Mirror Universe episode where they have scene by scene the First Contact scene, but instead of Cochrane giving his hand in friendship, he brings out a shotgun and guns down the Vulcans. It is a fantastic episode. It's so stupid and over the top, it's great, but they reference it there. As you said, in Picard at the very end, they use the really just iconic soundtrack from this film. So the fact that even now in 2023 that they're still referencing this film is just absolutely fantastic, and it just shows how beloved this is within the franchise.
It's just so well put together. I mean, I'd forgotten it was part of the Enterprise opening scenes, actually. But yeah, of course, it's been a long road. You're either with that or you're not.
See, I'm with it, but there are so many people, and I was shocked when I heard that people don't like that.
You can find some pretty nice on like streaming sites where people have made their own instrumentational version of that song, and it works quite well. I think it worked well for what people expected, but when you compare it to all the Star Trek themes that came before it, it was such a different way of doing it. I mean, it was like, whoa, what's this? And especially using like a pre-existing song as well, although it does fit. But you have those fantastic scores from Goldsmith, and all of a sudden you get this, and you get a pre-existing song. It was a bit of a shock for people, I think.
Can you imagine if they used something like this in this film? The Borg cube just assimilating the Earth, and all you hear is, "It's been a long road." I think people would have walked out, being like, "Nah, this isn't my cup of tea. Sorry, guys, sorry." But as you said, though, the intro to this film is absolutely fantastic. But I do have make that two slight gripes about it. Don't get me wrong, there'll be a couple of nitpicks I'm going to throw out here, but overall, spoilers. Absolutely love this film, and also spoilers again that we are going to be talking about spoilers. So if you haven't watched First Contact yet, feel free to pause the episode, go watch it, come back, and feel free to join us on this. But the two main issues I have is I feel as if this is kind of a thing that is carried on throughout the rest of the series, and it's kind of a thing that it set a precedent to what was to come later. The fact that it was more action heavy, action oriented, and a bit more gory at times, because you see the beginning that Picard is, as you said, 6 years previously, he's captured by the Borg, and it's just very terrifying visuals. But then we have a fake jump scare where he's like looking in the mirror and a Borg, I don't know, whisk or something pops out of his cheek, and then he wakes up again, and it's like, was that necessary?
I loved it, mate. I loved it. Because it harks back to, and I don't think they've made the episode by then, but I think there's an episode, is it Enterprise or Voyager, where they invent the teleporters, and it's like the first, I can't remember which one it is. It's been a long time, and a long road. The first guy to teleport sees through his hand, and it's a bit of like a strange kind of Back to the Future moment. But no, I enjoyed it. Yes, it is a bit nightmarish, but I think it plays into kind of his state of mind. But it didn't come across as like a cheap jump scare, but I thought the intro was brilliant. I love that whole intro.
I think the issue I have with it isn't so much like the beginning bit where he's trapped in the cube and it zooms out and everything. I think that's incredibly done, but the way when he wakes up and then he has to wake himself up again, so he's like in a dream within a dream. time. I was kind of like, right, okay, they've just thrown it in because it's a movie and everything. But then, of course, we go from that to the huge action scene where the Federation are fighting the Borg. And honest to God, I love it. I'm going to be honest. Like, I know Star Trek isn't, or it didn't used to be as much of an action-oriented show and everything, but oh my God, it is so cool seeing all these Federation ships just blasting the hell out of Borg Cube, or trying to.
Yeah. Perhaps today is a good day to die. I think that was part of like the specialness of Star Trek in that they always had the weapons, but the weapons were kind of like after we thought about it and planned it out. They never really had space battles. That was kind of a special episode, usually the finales or like a big storyline, but really few and far between. It was always more the threat in an episode and that kind of tension. Whereas in this, I mean, like you said, like the fighting and all the different starships, it's just, it's great.
The only other nitpick, as I was alluding to before, was when we finally see the Defiant doing what it was described to do in Deep Space Nine, where they say, oh, the Defiant, which is this new, for anyone who doesn't know, it was like this new Federation ship that was built purely for warfare, and it was built specifically to counter the Borg as a prototype. But it's one of these things that I have seen in a lot of films and series where they always build up a particular thing, especially the Defiant. The Defiant, they're always saying, it's the best ship in the fleet, it's blah, 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 it does this, it does that, it cooks your toast in the morning, gets your coffee, reads you the newspaper, and then when push comes to shove, it gets absolutely bodied and destroyed nearly.
Unsinkable Satsu, is that what
Exactly, yeah. Cough, cough, yeah.
Oh, you just knew I was going to drop that. Yeah, they did kind of build it for the new Federation battle fleet. But then again, though, I mean, if we're going to start nitpicking, like in the Enterprise, whether it's, the flipping B class or D class or E class or whatever you want to go, there's many letters in the alphabet, as Picard says in this, but that's supposed to be like one of the greatest ships in the fleet. With the amount of times it gets blown up or like the dish flies off, there's quite a few times. And if flipping heck, in the J.J. Abrams universe, it's crashing every other week, so.
That is one thing I absolutely hated about those films. Purely the fact that every single film that's getting blown up, and I'm like, really? I mean, it didn't even get that blown up in the TOS films, with the exception of the third film, Rest in Peace, Enterprise. I don't know. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's always getting destroyed or pieces pulled apart, and I know the reason why they have the Defiant. It's purely because of Worf being introduced in the story, which I always find weird that they brought in Worf, but they didn't bring in O'Brien or any of those characters, because actually that was something that you and I were actually talking about before we started this episode, about how Whoopi Goldberg, who plays Guinan in the TNG series, and she has like a long-standing history with the Borg, wasn't even asked.
See, I've thought about this, and I think if they'd have had her in it as Guinan, she was always like a sounding board for Picard, when he went to the bar and that kind of thing. I think if they'd have had her in this, she would have taken the role of Lily. I think she'd have taken that lady's role. So I think to kind of counter that, they're like, right, well, she's not in this one. And I'm not sure if they, I mean, I don't know if she's still in the Nexus. I'm not entirely sure how they I don't think they even address it, but who knows?
No, I don't think so. And I think the reason behind that is, it's going back to what I was saying, that these films set a precedent of being more action-oriented rather than... I'm not saying that all the episodes of TNG were slow burner thinkers and things like that. There were a couple of action-y-esque ones, but, they were never, like, over the top, partly because they didn't have the budget for it, probably. But you could definitely see that during this time, and I was looking it up earlier, but during this time, I think Voyager had just started in 1995, and at this point, DS9, the show that was oriented towards a huge galactic war between the Federation and all of its allies versus the Dominion and all of its allies, so like the anti-Federation, as it were. So the Federation at this point were getting geared more towards a militaristic aspect. So you could see, especially on the Enterprise itself, that they did have the holodeck and everything, but what they also have, which is something that bled through unfortunately, to later seasons, whether that be Discovery or, God forbid, Picard, where the ships don't really feel like a home. They feel very cold inside, very metallic, yeah.
Yeah, Discovery, I mean, if you like it, fantastic, right? But it's just, I stuck with it for a series, so can't say I didn't try, mainly for Jason Isaacs, if I'm honest. I watched it because he was in it. And I just thought the main character, she was just so unlikable. And she gets kicked off and kicked out of the Federation, then she's back, then she's a first officer, and it was just like what they did in the kind of the reboot, the 2009 one, which I enjoyed, but that was very much like, oh, well, Picard's on board, so I guess we'll make him first officer. It's like, well, Starfleet Academy doesn't work like this. Like, you don't just walk in and get, and there was swearing in it, and it just felt modern in a lot of ways, that it was like, no, this isn't right. And it got boring, and it dragged, I mean, God, I think it's just been cancelled or ended or whatever you want to say, but it's like 4 or 5 series. I don't know anybody who's still watching it. In real life, I mean, I know like, there's always people on the socials who say, oh, it's the best thing ever, which is, if it is for you, then good for you, because I don't know anybody who watches it. And then the same with the other one. Picard, yeah. Again, I mean, tried to watch the first series of that. Oh, God, almost unwatchable. I mean, this broken, decrepit old Picard, and nobody wants to see that. And then I think I've heard on the grapevine, I've not watched it yet, but I've heard that couldn't bring myself to watch the second series, and then the third series apparently, because rumour has it, it's been made by people who like love Star Trek. I'm not saying the other people didn't, but apparently it's been made by someone who really like is a proper Trekkie. That's really kind of turned it around, or so I've heard. But just some of the rubbish they've thrown out there with like the Lower Decks one that looks like a cartoon. It looks like a cross between Star Trek and Family Guy, but not as inventive. And then you've got Strange New Worlds, which is like, I was saying this to the person at work, the Trekkie at work, like, when did the Star Trek series stop standing on their own 2 feet? That Discovery one, like she was Spock's sister or some absolute just convoluted rubbish. It was just absolute, oh, you swear on this, absolute shit. It was just absolute rubbish, just grasped out of nowhere by, is that the best you've got? Star Trek used to be really inventive. Like, yes, it started to struggle in its later years with Enterprise and kind of eventually gets cancelled and they all finish, but they were always trying to do something new. They always had new captains, new crews. Yeah, they had a few characters like Worf and the Doctor who would like float around every now and again and appear in different things. But the last few series have just been like, and then you get Strange New Worlds. Like, I have no interest in watching that. Pike and before the original series, it's like, no, why don't you just make something new and sell it on its own merit? But they just don't seem to be able to do that. I think people forget now how much of a gamble like the Next Generation was. A lot of people think, thought at the time, not that I was there, but a lot of people apparently thought at the time that this was going to be a real struggle because, well, you've got the original crew there. This isn't going to work. Whereas now, if anything, I would argue that the Next Generation's arguably a little bit more popular than the original series. Maybe it's just a passage of time. Who knows? But it was a big gamble.
See, the thing is, though, and especially with this film, they are definitely a time capsule of the way that sci-fi was seen at the time. So, for example, with the 60s and 70s, it's very much that very campiness. It's over the top, it's, oh, look at us, look at our idea of peace through the stars, because, 60s and 70s, that was the kind of big movement at the time. Whereas with the 80s and 90s, it was a little bit more cynical, but not to the extent that it is nowadays. And when you get to the late 90s with the Next Generation films, like especially with First Contact, with Nemesis as well, those films have much more of an edge, especially the ones that bleed into the early 2000s. And I feel as if First Contact seems to be that sweet spot, to be honest, between one that's overly gritty versus one that maybe doesn't go far enough. For example, with Star Trek Insurrection, which I was surprised that came after this. I thought it came well before, but that was just very campy, over the top. It was more of a long episode. Then you've got Nemesis, which is the absolute opposite end, where it's nothing but action. It's got a lot of quite, I suppose, problematic elements now that you look at it, with the whole invading people's minds, and I'll just leave that sentence there for anyone who hasn't seen it. But, you get to this film and you get a genuinely terrifying villain, because I feel as if nowadays the Borg have become almost Funko Popified, if that makes sense. That idea of a villain that was absolutely amazing on its debut with the TNG series, and then they brought them back a couple of times, and then they kind of brought them back a little too much in Voyager.
Do you watch Doctor Who much, Satsu? Right,
yeah.
I've got a perfect comparison for the Borg. The perfect comparison for the Borg in New Who, Doctor Who since 2005, is the Weeping Angels. The first time they appeared, they were terrified. Then they brought brought it back again. They were slightly less scary. Then they brought it back again. Then they brought it back again. And it's like, right, you've diluted them now.
No, you're absolutely spot on, because, yeah, the Weeping Angels were just terrifying when you first saw them. They were, for anyone who doesn't know, they were just like stone statues that as soon as you blinked or looked away from them, they were able to move, but they would, contort themselves into really scary positions, and the light would be flickering and they managed to get you. And it was absolutely fantastic. And it's the same with the Borg as well, because the whole concept of the Borg is they don't really have any subjective feelings. They're like the antithesis of the Federation. I know I kind of joked earlier about the Dominion being the anti-Federation, but the Borg practically are a mirror of what the Federation could be. They are just one hive mind. They just operate for the collective. They don't think about free will. They just assimilate worlds and they make you into a drone. And I don't know about you, but the thought of having my individuality just ripped away from me and having to be conscious throughout that, because even Picard in that episode where he gets captured by the Borg, and the follow-up episode, that's a great one, where he goes home and he just has such an emotional breakdown with his brother about how he wasn't able to do anything, and that kind of gives him the courage to compose himself and get back into the boots of becoming Jean-Luc Picard. Nowadays, as you said, it's become so diluted because Picard, the TV show, used them so many times that it kind of became unbearable. That, by the time they brought them back and you're like, oh great, the Borg, oh yay, there's the Borg in season 2, oh, is that more Borg, oh great.
Whereas you get the feeling in First Contact that they are absolutely unstoppable.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a little bit like, and I know this is a random comparison, but it's a bit like the creatures in X-Men Days of Future Past, where it doesn't matter how many times you kill them, they will learn from that and adapt. Or the alien creatures in the massively underrated Tom Cruise / Emily Blunt vehicle, Live, Die, Repeat, Edge of Tomorrow, that kind of thing. I love that idea that it doesn't matter how much you kill, you learn and you try and take us down, we'll learn from that. I love that through the film, we've got 10 shots, we've got 12 shots, we've got 1 or 2 shots if we're lucky. It makes us such great tension, and they kind of beat them on fluke really with Data, and they're pretty much stuffed. So but I know what you mean. Like when you talk about Star Trek reflecting the time it's in, yeah, I get what you mean, and people can argue that we're in a much more cynical time. But for me, we wouldn't be if media didn't keep telling us we were in such a cynical time. If we just decided to look at the positives a little bit more instead of just forever looking at the negative, we might find a little bit like the message is in this film. They've come through, Cochrane in the 21st century. They've come through a Third World War, a nuclear war. The band of survivors that are around are in all these factions. They agree not to fire on each other, which is what they think the Borg have. They don't realise the Borg aren't a faction. He's basically thinking, I'll get money, I'll create this new spaceship. That's what his motivations are, I'll be honest. And this Cochrane guy, played brilliantly by James Cromwell, who's also in the Green Mark Grey film. But he's thinking that, whereas in the future they've looked back on it and been like, he wanted to reach the stars. Wasn't this First Contact moment where the Vulcans, it turns out, spoiler alert, come down and see that humans have got warp drive and basically come down to wish us to live long and prosper, which is a great scene. But from their point of view, it's all the view of like, oh look, we look back and you were like really positive, and he's like, well no, that wasn't the reality. And I just think if we just used a little bit of that optimism in some of the newer Star Trek, I know how this is going to sound, but I don't care. The best Star Trek that's going now is the Orville. Seth MacFarlane's the Orville by an absolute country mile. If you want proper Star Trek Next Generation stuff, go watch the Orville. That's where you're going to get it. That got better and better and better.
Well, you raise an interesting point, because you were talking there about the whole progression of the series after this into this more cynical worldview. The fact is that it has changed, probably for the worse or for more of a different audience, let's say, rather than the more optimism of like the 90s and maybe by extension the 2000s before things started to go downhill. But it feels as if this film encapsulates quite well what made Star Trek so iconic. And I think it relates to two things. It relates to the setting, first of all, where they go back in time. And I know people have said this. It ends up, once the Borg get destroyed, quote unquote, they release this ship that can travel back in time, and people put up their glasses and snort and say, oh, why didn't they go back to the 1950s? 1950s and do that. That's not the point. There wouldn't be a film if they didn't go back to this particular point. But the point they go back to is 10 years after the Third World War's over, the world is just in shambles. It is just a wasteland and everything. There are different coalitions and factions fighting for control, and they land in, I think it's April 4th, literally the day before they are going to be discovered by the Vulcans. And as you said, Cochrane just wants to be, he just wants very materialistic things. He sounds a bit like a Ferengi saying, oh, I just want women and money and I want to sell it off, I don't care. And you can understand why, because he lives in this hellscape, this apocalypse. But on the flip side, you've got two stories going on. You've got the crew members trying to convince Cochrane to go ahead with the flight of the Phoenix. But on the other side, you've also got Picard struggling with this inner turmoil with him wanting revenge. And there's the obvious yet very fantastic comparison that they make in the film where Lily references Moby Dick. And that, of course, is the whole story of a captain that gets so jaded about this white whale that maimed him that he hunts it for all his life, and his whole life is just consumed with this anger. And it's the same with this. And as I said before, I feel as if nowadays the whole idea of Wolf 359 and people being like, oh, I've been hurt by the Borg, it's like, oh, grow up, there's worse things out there. It's like, come on now. The fact is, you've got Picard wrestling with that, and you even see him go to a very dark place. Even times where he is actively enjoying killing people, he doesn't even flinch when he rips out the heart or the data or memory core or whatever it is.
He rifles them, the data card, where he rifles them full of hollow bullets because he disengages the safety protocol. He's not minding his caboose dicks there, is he? So he pulls out his Tommy gun and rifles down the Borg. And then the crew basically saying to him, look, they're losing every single deck. They've lost over half the crew to the Borg. And it's like, look, we need to retreat. He has that awesome scene with Worf where he's like, I think you're being a coward. And obviously Worf being a Klingon, I mean, to call, it's death before dishonor. To be called a coward, that it is absolutely disgraceful. It's worse than a disgrace. So he is like, if you were any other man, I would kill you where you stand, or whatever he says. And then you get Picard, but they're all so ingrained in following his decisions because they're usually the right ones that they continue to do that. But you get Lily, who ends up there because she passes out because of radiation sickness. She's in the 21st century. She's Cochrane's. Well, they insinuate towards the end that they're going to get together, but she's great, and she's basically reminds him that, look, Jean-Luc, blow up the damn ship, blow up and he's like, no, and he screams no, and he smashes the model that you see through the series with the model ships behind, with all the different Enterprises and different ships, and he gives the awesome speech, I will not sacrifice the Enterprise. We've made too many compromises already, too many retreats. They invade our space and we fall back. They assimilate entire worlds and we fall back. Not again. The line must be drawn here, this far, no further, and I will make them pay for what they have done. And she's like, oh, you broke your little ship, see around Ahab, and like you said, she's referring to Moby Dick and, the whole somebody's white whale, but it's just absolutely fantastic. And that's before you even get to the scenes between Data and the Borg Queen. It's just fantastic stuff. It really is. It's top-notch Trek. Like, I don't think it gets much better, to be honest. And it's got a good sense of humour in there. Yeah, it's a little bit, it's not goofy. It doesn't quite get to goofy, but, there's certainly some stuff in there with Data, which is very, how long is it, Data? I'm fully functional, all that kind of stuff, but it's very tongue-in-cheek. It makes sense of what she's trying to do, because if you wanted to get Data to give up the code, you need to kind of turn him, and how do you turn an android with no emotion? Well, flick his emotion switch back on. Give him skin. Yeah, I know, I like that stuff. I thought it was clever. It all makes sense. I like a story that makes sense, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. It tells the story in a relatively believable way within the universe itself. Again, there's bits and pieces that you could pick apart and be like, well, why did the Borg go to this part of human history? Why did they do this? Why have they got a time machine? Blah, blah, blah. But in terms of what we've got here, in terms of the story itself, it is just done in such a good way that doesn't necessarily, as we said, compromise what made Star Trek Star Trek. And when Picard, this is the annoying thing, because when Picard in later films and then later series and then overall later series that aren't related to Picard, when they have an action scene, human life just seems very disposable, almost to the point that it feels very much like the Warhammer 40k universe at times, especially in Into Darkness. I always remember that. There's a scene where they blow a hole in the side of the ship, and these people are getting sucked out completely. And these poor people, even in the the original TNG series, they were always very remorseful. Like, there's an episode, ironically enough, called Lower Decks, where a Bajoran crewmate is asked to do an undercover mission, and spoilers, skip 5 seconds ahead if you don't want to find out what happens, but she gets killed, and Picard has to give a full speech saying so-and-so got killed while on active duty. She was a fantastic member of the crew, whereas when it comes to Nemesis and everything, they're like, woohoo, human life, what's the cost of that? They just have all these over-the-top action scenes and they don't really give you time to breathe or mourn over them. And you do have scenes like that in this, where Picard initially is just willing to sacrifice his crew to stop them from invading the ship, as we said, but then at the same time, it does link back really well, because you get that scene in the holodeck where he rips the, as we said, the data code out, and he says very coldly, yes, that was Ensign Lynch, and he doesn't blink when he does it. He just sees a comm badge, and then it's just like, yeah, sure. And there's another bit I'm a bit annoyed at where he kills someone who's been assimilated or just mid-assimilation, and I was like, well, Picard, if you don't mind me saying, you were rescued and deborgified.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's a very damaged Picard. I know people who don't like Picard in the films at all, because he goes from being somebody who would, the complete antithesis of Captain James T. Kirk, in that he wouldn't rip his shirt off and start to fight. He would think his way out of a situation. He was a thinking man's captain. Whereas in the films, he gets very much, especially as it goes on, it becomes more action oriented. I think he's a very damaged captain. He's clearly suffering, although part of me is thinking, well, why? Why is it taking him 6 years to all of a sudden start having this? But it's not, not uncommon. And maybe the fact the Borg are around and he can hear them has triggered some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, because he is very much a captain. Well, he's a person struggling with that. You can see it throughout. And yes, he's very cold at times. I mean, I would say I think it's kind of more of a mercy killing. Not that I'm advocating such, but it's just a film, because he knows that the guy's going to suffer. And there's one point where he says to the crew, you'll probably meet assimilated crew members. Trust me, just shoot. You'll be doing them a favour. And it kind of feels like sometimes he feels like he'd rather have died. But I did think, well, they saved you. So, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of death in this one. But it just serves to underline how ruthless the Borg are. You can't talk you out of this one, John Luke. And I mean, not that he's in a fit state to for most of it, but I do know that conflicts, because some people feel like he goes, not myself, I can see why people would argue it, but I think he goes from being a thinking man's captain to being essentially a kind of a warmonger, somebody who would much rather run towards a battle than run away from it. Well, he literally does in this. He disobeys orders. And to be fair, gives one of the best lines of the film with Data, where he's like, sir, I think I speak for all of us here when I say, to hell with our orders. And it's like, yeah, go on. Funnily enough, if anything, I actually feel like out of the whole crew, Riker, maybe it's because he was under, Jonathan Frakes was on directorial duties, but he feels not massively involved in this one. Maybe that was on purpose. And of course, it is so focused on Picard that it does make sense. But what did you think? Did you feel like it just felt like a few of them, the ones that kind of were beamed down. I mean, Beverly Crusher does virtually nothing. You've got Jordan LaFord, just virtually nothing. You get the great scene with Deanna Troi where she's pissed. That's a good scene with her and Jonathan Frakes and James Cromwell. And so that you feel like a few of them are kind of sidelined a little bit, because this is Picard's baby. But if that's what needs to happen for such a good film, then then I'll accept it. I'm sure they get their time to shine elsewhere. I don't know how you feel about that. Or...
Well, here's an interesting trivia fact. I don't know if you know. Apparently, in the earlier drafts of this film, the roles of Picard and Riker were supposed to be swapped. So Riker was supposed to be the one fighting the Borg on the Enterprise, and Picard was supposed to be helping Cochrane try to get the Phoenix up in the air.
That makes more sense. That makes more sense.
It does, doesn't it? But do you think that would have worked the same?
No, because you'd have had to have taken out all the stuff about because he's never been assimilated. But I do think Picard would have cut his losses far earlier. I mean, they're on that ship till they try to self-destruct it right at the 11th hour. I mean, the crew's virtually wiped out, apart from the main deck, and there's virtually nobody left when they decide, right, we need to cut our losses. I think Riker would have done it much earlier. I think he'd have evacuated much earlier. But it makes more sense, but it certainly wouldn't have made for a good film, to be honest.
I think if it was an episode, then maybe it would have, but I totally see what you mean. Thematically, it does make more sense for Picard to become very obsessive with the ship. I totally agree with you. Going back to what you were asking there about whether or not I think that they don't really have anything to do, you're right. Once Crusher gets out of the sickbay and then Lily kind of branches off, that's really all she does in the film. Troy and Riker, they're just kind of there. It sounds weird, but it feels almost as if, and nothing against Jonathan Frakes, I think he's a fantastic actor, and Riker is one of my favourite characters, but I feel as if it's like in this film, he's the kind of person that he's won a ticket to be on a Star Trek film, if you know what I mean. So he's a bit part in the background in this. You're obviously not at the beginning. At the beginning, he is relatively instrumental, but once he's down there, yeah, him and Geordi really more focused on getting Cochrane up in the sky.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I do think, I mean, it might be wrong. There might be there was no deleted scenes on there. There was only like a teaser trailer and a theatrical trailer, which were great, by the way. We've lost the ability to do good trailers as well in the last few years, but there was no like special features outside, no deleted scenes or anything, at least in the DVD that I've got. I don't know in that respect, but yeah, I don't know if in that respect whether there were deleted scenes and they kind of siphoned down and took bits out of that Earth sequence. But I would argue that Jonathan Frakes probably keeps his character out of it as much as he can so that he is able to direct it. I mean, it works, the story. I think it works that you've got those two sorting things out. And yeah, I did think that, but the Borg are taking over the ship, and I'm thinking, why don't you kind of like blow up that rocket, but the spaceship? But I suppose, yeah, they do their best to.
Yeah, I see your point, because if he is directing the film, you don't want to be too involved, otherwise it becomes the Riker show feat Picard. The thing that is great about this film is just, as we were talking about before, is how thematically great this film is. Like, as we said, you've got the Borg storyline between Picard, and you've got the subplot with Data and the Borg as well, which is interesting, if not just a bit strange in a way. I know why they got Data out the way, because I think the film would have been over a lot sooner if Data was beside Picard rather than in the hands of the Borg Queen. And Alice Krieg does a fantastic job as the Queen in this film.
That shot of her coming down to connect with her body took ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, 5 months to do, and it still holds up. A lot of the stuff, I meant to say this earlier, a lot of the effects hold up. Yes, there's a few bits here and there where it shows that it's got best part of 30 years old, but it's going to. Like, CGI is always going to go that way, but they used a hell of a lot of model work in this film from what I was reading. That whole section where the navigational deflector scene, where they go on like the dish underneath and they have to stop the Borg because the Borg are trying to shoot down, and if that happens, it's all over. And I love that scene, and it was just great. The tension of attacking the Borg, and I like the fact that the Borg won't engage you until you become a threat, so you can essentially walk through them as long as you don't threaten them. Yeah, I thought that made for like such a fantastically creepy scene, especially when Picard's trying to lead Lily through them and she's screaming and he's just like, look, kind of keep going, because usually it like felt almost like a zombie film where you camouflage for them a little, like World War Z a little bit. So yeah, I liked that. That was good.
Yeah, the surprising thing is, for a lot of films in the late 90s that were made, especially sci-fi ones, you don't really expect them to hold up as well effects-wise, but the effects in this are absolutely fantastic. Even today, as you said, you've got that horror film vibe, you've got the dark, claustrophobic corridors. The scene especially I love is when the security team are walking through the corridor and then they manage to break through to one of the doors because they're getting chased, and then all you see is the eyepiece lights just shining
that was
through.
Great, that, yeah.
Yeah, it builds tension so well. And I know I talked about the jump scare, quote-unquote jump scare, you know, it was a minor jump scare at the very beginning, but, you know, there's no real cheap scares. It's more the horror of being assimilated by the Borg, and it brings back the horror and the fear. If you're watching Star Trek nowadays thinking, oh, they're not so scary, they just fly around in a Rubik's Cube, watch this film and you'll see how scary they're really supposed to be.
And the film as well was, I mean, it's set in the mid-21st century, but it was originally going to be set in the European Renaissance, which would kind of fit slightly with the way the series have gone before, showing Picard as like a captain on a ship type thing in the holodeck. But actually, I mean, that would have made for an interesting film. I don't think it would have worked as well, and I can imagine budget-wise it would have been an absolute disaster to try and, but I think it was definitely interesting. I mean, and the Borg were redesigned as well because they were never happy with how they looked in the series because, you know, budget concerns, but obviously with the film you have a lot more money. The ship, I mean, I was surprised because I'd forgotten the Enterprise E. It's a lot slender than the Enterprise D, so it looks a bit differently, and yeah, it all seems to come together really well, and it's no wonder that this is kind of pretty sure it's rated one of the best in the series in terms of the films, definitely.
Out of the TOS era and TNG, and I mean even extending to the later films, would you say that this is probably one of, if not the best Star Trek film that they've put out?
Yeah, I think so. Quite comfortably, I'd argue that. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Generations, which I know is not everybody's cup of tea. But yeah, I think this is definitely the best Next Generation film they did by an absolute mile. I'm a Trekkie, so I hope people know what I mean by this next bit, but it's a good film in its own right. Like, I feel like you could have walked into this in 1996, never seen Star Trek before, and got what was going on, because it lays it out for you. It doesn't spoon feed you, but it's Picard says 6 years ago I was simulated, blah blah blah, and it brings everybody in. And yeah, you might have been a bit confused as to kind of Riker and a few of them that were sidelined a little, but I'll take it. That outside of that, it's like, yeah, this is great. They should have had a great time. I do think it's one of the best ones, and it has made me, the minute I finished watching it, I was like, where's my Insurrections DVD? Where's the other one? I was dying to start another one. So yeah, I forget how much I enjoyed it. And I like the little moments where Star Trek never forgets that it's about people and relationships, and not just our relationships with each other, but our relations across like the world and with different countries and stuff, and what it means to be human, and what does it mean to be human. And so you have Data in the bit where Picard's talking about seeing the rocket in the Smithsonian and never been able to touch it, and he stands there and he touches the metal, and obviously Data holds it and starts computing all these deflections and inflections and these faults in the metal, and Picard says, it's a very human emotion to touch something, it makes it more real to you. And I love that Star Trek never forgot those little moments. It never, because it was always at the base of it, the writing was, I'm making it sound like some kind of utopia. They weren't all fantastic, don't get me wrong, but it never forgot. Even in like the worst series or the worst films, they always had moments where they reminded you, we know what we're doing. With those moments where you thought, yeah, good writing, good scenes, good characterization. Even in like the films that didn't really land, Nemesis, there was always moments where it showed you that glimmer of why it's so special and why it's gone on for as long as it has in all these different iterations. And I think that's something, not to bring it down because I'm not, but for me that is why the later series, from 2000, whenever Discovery started, they never connected with me in that way, because I'll give Picard season 3 a go, but they just never connected with me in that way, because the writing quality for me just isn't there. I don't understand that. We're like 30 years on almost from this film and we've got nothing anywhere near it, so it just pains me a little. But overall, but yeah, I absolutely love this one.
Because the fact that TNG came out relatively soon after the original series and their films, and it was more the late 80s and on to the 90s that Picard and his merry band of men, as it were, took to the Enterprise D and decided to do their adventures. But it feels as if the more and more the series goes on, the more it starts to lose track of what made Star Trek Star Trek. You've got a million and one cyberpunk dystopian sort of shows or films, and I've seen my fair share of good ones, bad ones. I've seen a lot of international ones recently where it's just no one will work together, everything's blowing up. I feel as if nowadays, and especially with this film, I feel as if they did have that very optimistic, like, oh, look at us, we all work together and blah blah blah, and it was just squeaky clean, then I can understand why people nowadays don't like that kind of point of view.
I think we're not getting given that option. If we were given that option, all we get all the time is told how bad everything is, how disenfranchised we all are from each other, and how separated, and how there's all this problem and that. No, if you put a series up like this, it was much more hopeful and was much more, you watch the people flock to it. I know it's really out there, but you look at the reception to a film like Top Gun Maverick, 40 years on, a film made in the 80s that was alright, wasn't great. Maverick comes along and blows it out of the water because it's an unashamedly positive, flag-waving action film that just goes, we know what you want and we're going to give it to you. I think if a series did what Star Trek does, it's like The Orville. I think The Orville is very similar to this. It tries to give you that more positive look. Yes, there's a bit of comedy sprinkled in there because it's Seth MacFarlane, but that, if people haven't seen The Orville, God, just go treat yourself. Stick with it in the first series because it was trying to find its feet in terms of drama and comedy, but after that, it really finds its feet, and it's exactly what this is. And it's made by a lot of the same people that made Star Trek Next Generation. Some of the same producers, some of the same composers, designers, the lot. He basically just went out there and was like, can we find understand the people who made this. I want to do my own version. And I think if people were given that option of having something that was much more positive and much more like, look, are we in rough times? Yeah, but we've always had rough times, and get through this. And tell you what, just don't mention what we're going through now. Give us a film where it's just, look, we'll get through this. It's a journey to the stars. Star Trek's back. You're going to love it. We don't want to be told about all the problems in 2023. I'm not interested, because I think that's the problem a lot of films make, a lot of series make. Oh, we need to reflect now. No, you don't. You're meant to be a fantasy show set in space. Just give me what I want. Give me good writing, and I will eat it up with a spoon, and then I'll go out and buy all the dolls and all the franchisey stuff. I'll go for it. But give me like negativity and darkness and death without any kind of levity. You can't watch that for very long. I think if we were given the opportunity for some kind of a series that was like, look, on the positive side, I think people would eat it up. And I think if it was given a chance to find its audience, we absolutely would. I mean, the Star Treks that are out now, they're not exactly killing it. They're not exactly blowing up.
Well, speaking of fantasy, and arguably one of the best trilogies of all time in terms of film, it actually reminds me of a particular scene from Lord of the Rings, in particular The Two Towers, where Frodo has pretty much a bit of a mental breakdown towards the end of the film. He is just completely despondent. He's nearly killed his best friend. You know, the world is burning, both literally and metaphorically around them. And he basically says, what are we fighting for here? What are we doing here? You know, what is the point of going on? And Sam has this absolutely beautiful speech where he essentially says, and this is how it's kind of summarised towards the end, he says, there's still good left in the world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. And that, to me, first of all, I feel as if that is just the perfect quote, because, you know, in this day and age, even with all the horrible stuff going on, there are good elements that we still have that people can't take away from us, and, you know, you have to hold on to that and remember. But in terms of Star Trek, that was something that they used to do so well. They used to tell you that, yeah, even in Deep Space Nine, you had this galactic war, which, don't get me wrong, there was horribleness in it. There was just utter atrocities going on, but at the same time, what they were fighting for was the Federation, for the rights of the individual, for people to have a future, to have those good times to remember back fondly. And especially going back to First Contact, that is exactly what they do here. It's the fact that initially Picard is so focused on getting his own way. He wants to kill the Borg, he wants to destroy them, and in any other film, any other sci-fi series, he would just do that. You know, all the crew would be dead, but he would be the, I don't know, Van Damme or Steven Seagal kind of character. Like, he would just kill the Borg Queen, and, you know, everyone would be dead, but he would be alive, and that's a happy ending in these kind of films. But it's the fact he manages to rein himself in, and the fact he says, I shouldn't have put myself first like that, to the extent that later on he apologises to Worf for, as you were talking about earlier, what he said and everything. And he finally realises about the bigger picture there, about the future of humanity. And I love the finale for this film. Whether people nowadays find it cheesy or not, I don't care. I just think it's beautiful. The fact that they meet the Vulcans, that he has no idea how to greet them, and he's like, so he just shakes his hand and everything. And it's just like that one moment that you know from that moment that an age of peace, and I was about to say prosperity, but not really, because I get rid of currency, but, you know, an era of just peace and a golden age of space travel is going to come from this one moment, and it's just beautiful to watch.
You hope so. It was I was surprised how emotional it was. Not like I wasn't crying or anything, but I was surprised how it is such like a heartfelt, hopeful message, and that was what Star Trek was always meant to be. And I think going back to what you were saying earlier, we were both talking about how the series as it's gone on, it's got further and further away from what Star Trek was meant to be. I think it was because Gene Roddenberry kept, you know, a very strong hand on the tiller in terms of what he felt Star Trek should represent and what it shouldn't represent. Obviously, once he passes away, he passed away in, I think, the early 90s, maybe 93, something like that. I think it is the last film he sees. Is it Generations? Or it might not even have been that far. Bless him. But he passes away, and then it's kind of like, right, well, where do we go now? And that's when you start to get people who bring in their own ideas on what Star Trek should be. And Star Trek was, you know, always meant to represent the future. And, you know, like Picard says, we've got away from currency, we've moved away from like what you don't get paid. And he argues argues in this that the ship's more like my home, and because Lily says to him, "Oh, a long time to be away from home," and he's like, "Well, actually, the ship is my home, and the crew is my family," and he doesn't say that, but you see it in the series and stuff, and it's like such an interesting way of looking at it, because for a lot of people now, jobs are just something you go to, and if you said to a lot of people, "Would you do this job if you didn't get paid?" No, very few of us are in jobs that we love. I mean, it's fantastic when you get that. I love when films do this, and I think that again, that's what made Star Trek stand head and shoulders above other things, including arguably Star Wars and Marvel. I know they're very different beasts, but just in terms of like, the future's not all war and the dark side and the light. The future is, yes, there's a few, there's Federation space and there's the stuff like that, and there are Klingons or there are Romulans or whatever that we have peace treaties with, and sometimes it doesn't quite go that way, but we're all different species and we're all trying to work it out. But humanity's really got shit together, and I'm like, I like that. Is it realistic? Who knows? But if you don't strive for something, if you just forever telling yourself and forever telling everybody around you that the world's such a horrible, prejudiced, dark place, then can it ever become something different? Because if it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're forever telling yourself you're useless, then are you ever going to rise to something? That got a bit deep, but you know what I mean? I like the fact the film's like, actually, you know what? If you get it together, work together, and look what you can do, we see that. I mean, it's a tough sell of an example, but you see that in countries where they're going through a natural disaster or a war, where everybody has to band. War's a horrible thing, of course, but disaster where everybody has to band together, because if they don't, it's horrendous for everybody. Where you have to put aside those individual wants and desires, and the idea that we could do that and actually push on. It's like great. And I'm not talking about communism, I'm not talking about that, because that's not what the film's trying to argue here. I don't want to get misconstrued, and I'm not getting political, I'm just saying. But it's what I've always loved about Star Trek. It makes you think. I've always loved films and TV shows that make you think, make you question. I can't remember who it was, but it'll be in my Shining episode if anybody wants to go check that out. I'm not plugging it, I'm plugging it for a reason, Satsu, I promise. Yeah, in that episode, there's a quote, and I watched all the behind the scenes, fascinating behind the scenes stuff, and I watched it, and one of the directors, and I can't remember, it wasn't the director of The Shine, it wasn't Kubrick, it was somebody else, and he perfectly summed up how I feel about films, and it was filmed like 30 years ago, or 20 odd years ago, and he basically says, films are not meant to reflect now. They can, if they want to be a period piece, but they are meant to be a fantasy. They're meant to give you different things to think about, or maybe reflect society back at you and have you think about it, but they're never meant to tell you where to stand. They're meant to tell you, right, this is what happens. It's like the earlier Star Trek series stuff. There's the episode that had one of the ones that I really enjoy, and it does have Wesley Crusher in it, so stick with me while I explain what I mean. In that he goes to a planet and he like runs on a grass to get a ball back or something, and he's broken one of their rules and he's condemned to death. But it's their rules, but Picard's like, well, hang on, he didn't know, he didn't mean to. And it's that kind of thing of it never used to tell you where to sit. It used to say, well, you can see where these guys are coming from, and you can see where these guys are coming from, and we're going to try and obviously put it down the middle somewhere, but you decide who's right and who's wrong here. I like that, always have.
The thing about the series itself is it always proposed these thought-provoking questions. Don't get me wrong, not all of them landed. Like, you had the weird goo monster episode, you had the one with the masks, you had some that you were just like, what the hell was this? But you have the other ones that, as you said, they provoke very interesting questions, like especially with the whole idea of the Prime Directive and everything. Is it right to involve yourself when you have the power, or is it right to stand back and let it happen, whether it's war or natural disaster? It was just such a thought-provoking show, and that definitely is retained in First Contact, I would say, because it's one of these films towards the end of TNG's run as a film series, which it is a shame that Insurrection and later Nemesis would be the last films, because, I mean, in my opinion, they weren't really that strong. They had their good moments, but just they weren't as strong as this, because at the end of the day, this is the one that still retained those values, even though there are a couple of things you can nitpick. Because earlier on, I put out a tweet asking people to give us their opinions. Someone actually got back. It was the Movie for Days podcast, who had said, looking purely at the TNG movies in relation to First Contact, it's either the first or second best to them. Lots of charm, jaw-dropping moments, and great guest actors. It's very well directed and lots of fun. It doesn't hold up to the tightest of scrutiny, but none of them really do. And I think that is a very interesting point there, that yeah, you can pick apart the film. You can say, well, isn't there a Dominion War going on at this point? Or what's going on here? What's going on there? But at the end of the day, if you're looking for a film with a relatively good message here about fighting for a better future as opposed to fighting for yourself, for very selfish reasons and hurting or sacrificing people along the way, then this is a great film that displays relatively the best of Star Trek. As I said, there's obviously the one or two moments, but beyond that, beyond in terms of the bigger picture, I think personally it does an absolutely fantastic job.
Yeah, and it poses questions that sometimes it doesn't answer, or partly answers. The whole argument about when does making a stand against an enemy become a pursuit of revenge, and can you ever truly rise above revenge? They pose that as well, like, you've got, Lily says to Picard, the 24th century, you've gone above war, you've gone above revenge, you've gone above all this. But I saw your face when you shot them Borg, you were almost enjoying it. And it poses that question. It never tells you who's right, who's wrong, because it doesn't need to. There was a time in the world where you didn't have to have, it wasn't so black and white. But she basically says to him, look, I saw your face, I was there, I saw what you did. And it's basically saying to you, 24th century, they say they're all hoity-toity and they've risen above all this stuff, but are they really? I mean, it's not being cynical about it, but it is just posing that question of, is it as rosy as they say? I mean, I would like to think it is, but nothing's ever perfect. It's fascinating.
This is going to sound like a really weird example to compare it to, but have you ever heard of the Total War series of games?
Yes, I have.
I remember playing that religiously, ironically enough, because it's set in medieval times, but I remember playing it religiously when I was younger, and, it was great for learning maps and things, but in that game, I would always get quite frustrated because there was a lot of nations. Of course, the aim of the game is you take a country in either Europe or North Africa or the Middle East, and you basically have to fight for your territory.
Is that the one that didn't they have a Napoleon one and a British Empire one, or an Empire one?
That's the one.
Yeah.
I remember getting so frustrated at moments. Like, there was one where I was playing the Holy Roman Empire, or as it's known today, of course, Germany, where I had taken Sardinia, which is, of course, the tiny wee island, it's bigger than Corsica, but let's not get into that. But yeah, it was just south of France/Germany. And I remember I took it, I was happy with myself, and I left my emperor there. Bad decision, because 2 seconds later, the Milan faction, now known as Italy, ended up killing him. So I decided, in a very rational way, to, wipe Italy off the map, because I was so angry that they killed my Holy Roman Emperor. And of course, the thing about that game is, if you're playing as a certain faction, like especially a Christian faction of the time, and you attack another Christian faction, then the Pope will excommunicate you, or he'll warn you off, and if you keep doing that, he'll give you into trouble. And the thing about it was, if you think about a game like that, where obviously it's a game, obviously this is a film, so there's no real world consequences, but in terms of me thinking, I'm just going to wipe this nation off the map, to which case these other nations would then gang up on me, and it was a very short run. But at the same time, it does kind of remind me of the way that Picard was just so fixated on, as we said, getting his revenge and everything, sacrificing his pieces, as it were.
Or was it less of a revenge for him and more of a, I have been on the receiving end directly of this collective, and I know the horror they will inflict upon Earth, and God knows how much. I mean, and she says, the Borg Queen, in that bit where she's like, to date, we've met many species, we've met many, we've assimilated a lot. This is not their first rodeo. Like, they've been doing this again and again and again. Same with the aliens in Independence Day. You get the feeling this is not the first time they've done this. They consume a planet and move on. You get that feeling that it's like, this isn't the first time they've done this. And maybe he is saying, this fast, we need to take a stand here, because if we don't. But I think he goes about it the wrong way. But I think his sentiments are initially right, that at a certain point you have to say, right, it doesn't make any sense, but we have to push through this. It reminds you of certain things that have happened in history where everything goes against a country, and it's like, no, we need to make a stand here. We need to make a stand, otherwise everything that we stand for, or have ever stood for, all the right and wrong, will go. You've seen that in country after country, and I think there's a point where you have to take that stand, and whether you live or die by that choice, you've got to try, because otherwise what you stand for, it goes. You don't know whether he's like, see why I like these films. This is This is like why he's wondering, like, oh, but I do agree he is PTSD and all that. He's really struggling, and I think he goes a bit too far, but I think his sentiments are correct. But again, it doesn't tell you. He never walks up to her and says, oh, yeah, thank you, like, you were right. And it's the same with Worf. He says, oh, I apologize for some of the things I said. So he never truly, there's never that true kind of like, oh, he was right, they were wrong type thing. It still leaves it's nuance. I love a bit of nuance, and we've lost that in films and TVs. We've lost it. Not all of them, but the majority of them. We've lost that nuance of, we're not going to spoon feed you. You're not thick. We're not going to spoon feed you and tell you what's right and what's wrong. We're going to let you work it out. We're going to not even let you work it out. We're just going to give you a fantasy film, or we're going to give you a film or a series and show you what it is. And these are the characters, and they're not all good, and they're not all bad. The bad ones aren't all bad, and the good ones aren't all good. But that's life, baby, and let's kick on with it. Let you enjoy it. We're going to make a great series.
No, you do make a good point, though, there. It is very nuanced, as you said. It is interesting to see that, because I suppose you could argue as well that he is saying that, oh, he's doing it for the Federation, but then you're kind of like, well, in a way he is, but because his opinions are so subjective towards this issue, because he has been kidnapped, and as you said, it's the idea that he knows what they're going to do to them, but he's kind of doing it in a very counterproductive way, that he's saying, oh yeah, just throw as many men as you can at them, or men and women at them, and it'll be fine, and obviously it's not, and his irrational side is coming out. Yeah, it's that idea of knowing when to quit, essentially, and eventually, of course, he sees reason, but before that point, you kind of think, is he going to see that before it's too late and everything? And you've got the very cheesy yet iconic lines in the film, like you've got the "assimilate this" by Worf, which is so cheesy, but it's so good. The only one I don't like, I have to say, and I feel as if it's so forced, is when they're talking to Cochrane and they're explaining how they're from the future,
Yeah,
and he
I know what
goes,
you're gonna say.
"What is, yeah." What is this, some kind of Star Trek? And I'm like, oh, even Star Wars didn't do that. Even Star Wars didn't go, what, is it some Star Wars or something?
I
It's
think
like,
Star Wars needs to take a longer look at itself before it starts throwing stones at any other franchises. That's it. I don't want to say you jumped the Millennium Falcon, but you did. No, I'm joking. But no, yeah, I that was the one line where I was like, oh god. It reminded me of that scene in Family Guy where he's like, he said it. He said the title of the movie. I'm a family guy. That's what it reminded me of, and I was like, oh, why? Because it didn't make sense for him to say it. If he'd have said, oh, you're on some kind of trek, I'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, I get that, because they're in the mountains, and that makes sense. But to be like, what is this, some kind of Star Trek? It's like, oh no, I agree with you. The minute you said, I was like, I know what he's going to say.
because I mean, even Q, I think it's the finale, the first part of the finale of TNG, where he says something about them trekking amongst the stars, and although it's obvious what the writers were getting at there, it makes more sense for someone to say trekking amongst the stars than this is some kind of Star Trek First Contact TM. What is this, some kind of Paramount Plus release? It's like, what the hell, Cochrane?
His character was great though. I did like that. I did like his character. I liked Lily. I thought she was great, and it was just all around just a cracking film, really. Because I've got to be honest, when I got in earlier, I was like, oh god, I could so go to sleep. But I thought, no, come on, watch First Contact, you'll be all right. And I never once did I want to turn it off and go to sleep. And that's saying something, because I am shattered. It's just great. I love it. I feel a bit sorry for people who grow up now and kind of if they think that Star Trek is just what the new series are, I'm like, oh, you need to go back. You need to go back and watch the good stuff. Like, watch the good stuff. Watch the series that invented the mobile phone years before it even turned up. It's a communicator. That's what it is. Like, we know what it.
And yeah, I would just reiterate that if you haven't seen this film yet and you're looking for just such a good bit of Star Trek content, definitely go see First Contact. It's available, I think, at the moment, or as of recording this episode. If you've got a Paramount Plus subscription, then you can get it for free on Amazon Prime. Well, I say free, but you know what I mean, free-ish. In Ferengi terms, yeah, free-ish. Yeah, I would wholeheartedly recommend this, and I would recommend this as well as a starting point as well, if you want to get into the Star Trek films, because if I was going to choose a series for people to start off with, always TNG, always. I mean, my partner, her and I actually watched Star Trek Picard the third season, thankfully not the first two, but because the third season was coming on, the same friend who introduced me to the series would come round every Friday and we would all watch it together. And, you know, she was really into the character. She was like, oh, Worf is cool. And, you know, she would recognise people. It actually led to a really cute moment when we watched this film together. And, you know, the scene where they're racing back and she's like, oh, look, there's Picard, there's Riker. And then you see the Defiant and Worf pops up. And she went, oh my God, it's Worf. And I was so proud. I was just so proud. I would definitely, obviously, the TNG series, if you're looking to get into the series, but if you're looking to get into the films, I would 110% say First Contact is your first port of call. I mean, Wrath of Khan as well, also a good shout, but I feel as if it's the perfect blend of modern, or maybe not blend, but maybe more of a bridge between the old Star Trek and what was to follow. If there's any Insurrection or Nemesis fans, or, you know, the Abrams films, then, you know, fair enough. We can't tell you that, oh, you shouldn't enjoy that, because if you enjoy them, that is perfectly valid.
If someone's opinion about a film affects yours, how much do you really love it?
Exactly.
I know how bad Batman and Robin is. Doesn't stop me loving it. And I believe you me, I know how bad it is, but I love it all to be. Love it to pieces. You could shout at me, tell me it's terrible. It's not going to affect me. So don't worry about what other people think. Enjoy what you like.
Yeah, I feel as if it is definitely the perfect bridge between what was to come later on, where it got a bit too gory and dark and it lost its way, versus the campiness of the earlier run, which, don't get me wrong, there is a charm to some of it. Some of it's aged poorly, but, you know, it was made in the 60s and 70s, so you can kind of give it a pass in some regards. Others, you're just like, nah, this doesn't hold up. But yeah, if you haven't watched this film, absolutely go watch it. You could not find a better Star Trek film. But on that note, where can these lovely listeners at home find your content?
Well, if you can wrench yourself away from listening to Satsu's amazing content, because he is killing it right now.
Oh, thank you.
Genuinely killing me how successful he is right now. But I'm joking. No, it's well deserved. If you fancy a little bit of some film reviews of all different manners with loads of different guests, Review It Yourself is the place to go, essentially. So it's hosted by me, Sean. I have guests on all the time, including yours truly, Satsu. Satsu's on there. We've done some bake-off stuff, but go check that out if you want. So basically, it's no politics, no pandering, no point. You can find us on Twitter. It's at Yourself Review. We're also on Instagram. It's Review It Yourself Podcast 2021. Good Pods, all these different places you can find us. I say us, it's just me really. And yeah, go on. I'm sure you'll find something there that you like. Although having checked my 230 odd, whatever it is, episodes I've done, haven't done a Star Trek yet. I'm disgusted in myself. I've done a Star Wars, not done a Star Trek. So yeah, I'll have to rectify that quick.
Honestly, it's been a pleasure being on your podcast as well. Genuinely, if you haven't listened to the Review It Yourself podcast, and especially our episodes together, please do, because they were a lot of fun to record and even more fun to listen back to. So definitely go check them out. I couldn't recommend them more.
Good starting point for anybody who's jumped over from Satsu's. Go listen to the ones with me and him, get a flavour of what my reviews are like, and then jump into some of the others. I'd recommend jumping into some of the ones I do with Bill from Bill Reads Bad Reviews. Those tend to do quite well. Give them a go as a starting point, and then work your way through all the others with my other fantastic guests.
Our crossover episodes are like the podcast version of Star Trek Generations. You know? Hopefully not with me falling under some rocks, you know, but...
Oh, no, you're falling under a bridge, falling off a bridge and getting crushed by a bridge.
Oh, yeah.
You could say to me, Satsu, who am I to argue with the captain of the Enterprise?
No. Yeah, and then he ends up coming back to life or something in the books. Oh, I don't know. I'll need to read that, but...
Oh, he wrote that book, didn't he, though? He co-wrote it with somebody, Shatner, I think. I think he did, anyway.
Of course he did. But then again, he did direct the 5th film, I want to say. He didn't do the screenplay, but he did direct it, which, yeah, you can certainly tell. He did it.
I know we never mentioned the directing, did we? No, so I'm not just saying.
I think we did.
The direction's decent. Jonathan Frakes decent.
Oh, yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. But honestly, Sean, thank you so much again. And yeah, if you want to listen to more Satsunami content, then you can catch us on our website, podpage.com/Satsunami, where not only can you get past episodes, but you can also get a absolutely fantastic interview that Sean and I did together, where we talked about the world of indie podcasting. So definitely go check that one out as well, either after this or after you're done with the collab ones over on his channel, so please go check that out. I also want to thank our amazing Pandalorian patrons, Robotic Battles Hoster and Sonia. Thank you so much once again for supporting the channel.
That's such a good mix of names, that.
See, you laughed the last time, I remember that. Robotic battle
I'm easily
toaster.
pleased. I'm easily pleased.
And yeah, if you want to check out either exclusive content or episodes a week early, you can check it out on patreon.com/Chatsunami. But until next time, stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly, live long and prosper. I've always wanted to say that.
Yes, that's nice. I like it. Yeah, I like it.